This video was brought to you by Adentro,
an ancient civilization whose origins are one of the world's biggest mysteries. The first major civilization on the Italian peninsula. The people who spoke a language that is not like any other language we know of. My name is Julie and welcome to the Etruscan language. The Etruscans are often described as mysterious for many reasons. Their origins are unclear, and their language is still not entirely deciphered. Greek and Roman historians regarded them as pirates and frivolous people, and did not give their culture the credit it deserved. That's why till these days in schools we study Greek history and then jump straight to Rome. But there was a very important piece in between these two, the Etruscan civilization, which in many ways shaped Rome. But first, some official info. The Etruscans inhabited the region of Etruria, which covers what is now Tuscany, western Umbria, and northern Lazio in Italy. At its height, the Etruscan civilization expanded to the Alps in the north and to Campania in the south. Pompeii were established by the Etruscans. They successfully rivaled Phoenicians and Greeks on the sea. From arts to engineering, from a writing system to gladiator fights, the Etruscans had everything that a major civilization of that period had. The attested usage of the Etruscan language extends from around the 8th century BC, flourishing through the early stages of the Roman Republic before gradually declining. By the 1st century BC, Etruscan had largely been supplanted by Latin, though it continued to be used in some religious contexts until the 4th century AD. The Etruscans got dissolved in the Roman Empire, and their language and customs were forgotten. But let's try to demystify the little we know about them. Emperor Claudius, who ruled over the Roman Empire between 41 and 54 AD, spent his free time writing historical treatises, including a 20-volume work about the Etruscans. That's what it's called. Such a massive book based on works by the Etruscan authors would have been an invaluable source on the history and the language of the Etruscans, and probably we wouldn't call their civilization mysterious at all if all the copies of this book weren't lost. We have to work with what is available to us. So, what do we actually know about the Etruscans? Herodotus places the origin of the Etruscans in Anatolia. According to him, their ancestors, the Pelasgians, left Lydia around 12,000 BC, fleeing a severe drought. They first colonized the Greek island of Lemnos, and from there migrated west and settled in what later became Etruria. Well, Herodotus shouldn't always be trusted. After all, he claimed that India was inhabited by giant gold-digging ants. But the closer the events he described are to Greece, the more precise and actually historic he gets. So we should take him seriously here. But at the same time, a later historian, Xanthus of Lydia, who was deeply informed about his people's origins, knew nothing about this exodus of the Etruscans. Even Romans liked to claim that they were descendants of the immigrants from Troy. Etruscans liked to reinforce Herodotus' theory for the same reason probably. There is nothing like the prestige of being descendant from an ancient culture. Some historians claim that Etruscans could have been one of the mysterious sea peoples who brought the Bronze Age civilizations to a collapse. When ancient Egyptians listed the tribes of the sea peoples, one of them was named Teresh. Etrusci or Tusci is a Latin name. Greeks called them Tyranoi. And yes, this is where the name of the Tyrrhenian Sea comes from. Teresh, Tyranoi sounds very similar. Coincidence? Well, probably in this case it is indeed a coincidence. Etruscans called themselves Rasena, so not even similar to Teresh. Yes, Egyptians could have used the Greek name, and yes, Etruscans were known as pirates, even though that could have been just a bad reputation created by the Greeks, their rivals on the sea. Finally, there is also the Lemnos stele, a giant rock from the 6th century BC with inscriptions that look suspiciously like Etruscan. That same Lemnos that Herodotus mentions as the place where Pelasgians fled from Lydia and from where they ventured to Etruria. So, is that it then? Checkmate, Herodotus was right. But what if this stele was installed not by the ancestors of the Etruscans, but by their descendants? Etruscan traders were roaming around the Aegean Sea in those times, after all. Another theory of the Etruscan origins is the autochthonous theory. Even in the 1st century CE, a Roman historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, claimed that the Etruscans were native to the Italian peninsula. Archaeological findings seem to support this hypothesis. The archaeological presence of the Etruscans can be traced as far as 12,000 BC. The culture that preceded the adoption of the Etruscan alphabet is called the Villanova culture. It is characterized by its distinctive burial practices with cremated remains placed in biconical urns. Prior to the Iron Age Villanovan culture, in the 10th century there was the Bronze Age Proto-Villanova culture, which itself descends from the Central European urn-filled culture. The name comes from the custom of cremating the dead and placing their ashes in urns, which were then buried in fields. However, the urn-filled culture is sometimes associated also with Indo-Europeans by some historians, and the Etruscans didn't speak an Indo-European language, that we know for sure. At the same time, there is a smooth continuity between the cultures of Proto-Villanova, Villanova, and the Etruscans. In fact, the Etruscan culture is basically Villanova, but with the writing system. In the 8th century BC, their culture started to get more sophisticated, probably due to contacts with Phoenician and Greek merchants, and thus getting access to the whole of the Mediterranean culture. They accumulated wealth, their settlements became cities, their art and culture flourished. Most of the information we have about the Etruscans comes from their necropolises. They took death very seriously. They upgraded the biconical urns of Villanova to mini models of their houses. The walls of the tombs depicted the underworld with endless feasts and partying. Etruscans generally loved a good party, which gave them a reputation of decadent people from the morally righteous Greeks and Romans. It was even okay for an Etruscan woman to feast alongside men, which was an unimaginable vulgarity. Genetics also supports the autochthonous theory. It seems that the DNA of the Etruscans wasn't much different from the surrounding italics. Interestingly, scientists also studied the genetics of their cattle, and it is actually of Anatolian origins. That is not a direct proof of the Anatolian theory though, as the cattle could have been brought from somewhere and then bred in Etruria, but still, it is interesting. What is even more interesting than ancient Etruscan cattle DNA is your DNA. This video was kindly sponsored by Adentro, and I am so excited by it because I'll finally see where my ancestors come from. So here we go. 61% Greek and Balkan. I don't know how is that possible. I really need to find out where this comes from. 8% Russia, 16% Baltic. I do come from Latvia, but I didn't know I had 16% Baltic heritage. This was really insightful, but in reality there is so much more in this report. All of this stuff, nutrition, intolerances, behavior, health, pharmacogenetics, what I like especially, since I'm the kind of person that appreciates evidence-based statements, that for every single metric there is a link to the actual research that talks about it, and each research is ranked in terms of study quality. The report is constantly updated since genetics is quickly evolving and we keep learning new information. Adentro don't ask you for your name or any personal information, just an email address. You can get 10% off with the code JULINGO for your DNA test or for uploading raw data if you've done a test already somewhere else, but you want to discover all of this extra information that DNA has to tell about yourself. While genetics and archaeology are primordial to understand the origins of a people group, there is also a third element to it, the language. And this is where we're at a dead end. Etruscan is an isolated language with no known relatives. It has been compared to every other language out there, to Semitic, to Basque, to Sumerian, you name it, but with no results. For now, we only know of two other languages that could be related to Etruscan, Lemnian and Rhaetic, but that does not help as well, because we know even less about those languages. Lemnian Lithuanian, the language of that lemnis stele we saw before, was spoken around the 6th century BC, but we only have a couple of inscriptions remaining. Raitic was spoken in the Eastern Alps. There are around 280 inscriptions in this language, the oldest also dating to the 6th century BC. These two languages could be the descendants of the Etruscans, or its relatives, or its ancestors, but it's hard to tell. The three languages are grouped into the Tersanian family, which is considered to be one of the Paleo-European language families from the population that precedes Indo-European migration and was probably there since the Neolithic Revolution. So these are the facts that we have for now. There is an archaeological continuity between the Proto-Villanova and the Etruscan culture. Genetics doesn't suggest any Anatolian migration. The Etruscan language is not Indo-European, and there are other two mysterious languages that could be related to it. Now the theories. The first realistic option could be that the Etruscan language was spoken in Etruria since the Neolithic times. In the 2nd millennium BC, the Proto-Villanova culture develops, and in the Iron Age it became the Villanova culture. In the 8th century BC, it gets a boost by connecting to the Eastern Mediterranean culture through Greek and Phoenician traders and develops its own writing system, becoming the Etruscans. They settled the island of Lemnos, and that's why the myth about their Anatolian origins was created. Sounds believable? I think it does. Now, how about the second scenario? Everything goes the same way, but around 1200 BC, a group of settlers from the island of Lemnos arrives to Italy. It is not a large group, so they quickly mix with the local population. But as their culture was more advanced, they conquered the land and formed the new elite. This allowed for their language to dominate, even though the genetic makeup and the culture remained the same. Something similar to what happened much later with the Hungarians. I have a video about it, so check it out. It's a very interesting and complicated story. And you can also check out my Patreon while I'm at it. Even vote for the next language. Would you like that? Then check out the Patreon. The arrival of more culturally advanced group of people might have also facilitated the development of the Proto-Villanova culture into something more sophisticated. So when the Greeks and the Phoenicians arrived, the Etruscans already had quite a good cultural base. They adapt the new influences and create something amazing. Now, does that sound plausible? Honestly, it could have happened this way as well. The only thing we know for sure is that the Etruscan language is the key to the deciphering of the Etruscan mystery. So now that we've discussed all the possible historic origins of the Etruscan people, let's finally dive into their language. In the 8th century BC, the Etruscans adopted the Greek alphabet, more precisely the Euboean Greek alphabet, common in the Greek colonies in Italy. Apparently, the Etruscans were very impressed by this invention because they were putting their alphabets everywhere. Here is the alphabet used as a decoration for the vase. Here is a god pointing to the alphabet, trying to tell us something about it. They even had a type of divination that involved observing lightning bolts. It probably seemed like the gods were writing messages in the sky for them to decipher. We can read Etruscan very easily. First, they almost didn't modify the Greek alphabet and they used the same 26 letters. Quickly, they omitted the letters that weren't useful for them. Like that, we know that they didn't have the sounds b, d, g, and o. They actually kept the Greek gamma, but were reading it as a sound k. That's why in the Latin alphabet, which was adopted from the Etruscan, the letter C, the descendant of gamma, is also read as k. The Etruscans also added this letter that looks like the number 8, pronounced as f. By the 5th century, their alphabet evolved and arrived to 20 letters. This is the alphabet that persisted until the fall of the Etruscans. The language had 4 vowels, a, e, I, u. As discussed, it lacked voiced stops b, d, g. Instead, it differentiated aspirated and unaspirated stops, p, t, k versus p, t, k. When they adopted loan words, voiced stops became unvoiced, like in the Greek triambos, which became the Etruscan triumphus and then Latin triumphus. In later texts, we see internal vowels disappear. That might suggest that there was a stress on the first syllable. There are more than 10,000 Etruscan inscriptions currently discovered. They usually wrote from right to left, or sometimes from right to left and from left to right in alternate lines. Words were written without spaces. In later texts, a dot or a colon is used to separate words. Some discoveries have been invaluable, for example the Pyrgi tablets, gold leaves with bilingual Etruscan and Phoenician inscriptions, sort of an Etruscan Rosetta Stone. The most famous is probably the Liber Linteus, or the Linen Book, an Etruscan book that was used for an Egyptian mummy ripping, discovered in a museum in Croatia. Just imagine the story. An Etruscan priest travels to Egypt with his sacred book. There he dies, or something else happens. The Egyptians were full into recycling and sustainability, so without thinking twice, they cut the linen book into narrow pieces and wrap a mummy in it. Fast forward a couple of thousand years, a European traveler buys a mummy in a bazaar in Alexandria as a souvenir and then donates it to a museum in Zagreb. Only there it was unwrapped and the texts discovered, which, after they were assembled, turned out to be the longest Etruscan text we have so far. The moral of the story? Recycling is key. The question now is, we found so many inscriptions. We know the alphabet. We even have a Rosetta Stone. Why haven't we still deciphered the Etruscan? Well, several reasons. Firstly, because the language is not like any other language, so we don't have any point of reference to help us out. And secondly, most of the inscriptions come from the burials and consist of some names or similar typical ritualistic phrases. But let's see what we have managed to understand about the Etruscan language so far. We don't know much about the Etruscan grammar, but from what we do know, it seems that Etruscan had cases. Probably 5 of them, but that's still open to debate. Etruscan was an agglutinative language, and we see that it used extensively suffixes and postpositions. The word order was probably SOE, but in the ritualistic phrases we even see OSV or OVS, probably for poetic reasons. It seems there was grammatical number, but no grammatical gender, and there were 2 different pronouns for animate and inanimate things. Because of the nature of the inscriptions that have been found, we know even less about the verb. We recognize that there were present and past tenses, active and passive voices, indicative and imperative moods, but we're not even scratching the surface here. It's possible that the verb system was super complex, but for now, that is one of the many Etruscan mysteries. Vocabulary is a mystery too. Most of the times, the linguists have to guess the meaning from the context of an inscription and then see if it makes sense in other texts as well. We know a lot of Etruscan names, of course, since most of the findings come from the burial grounds. We know the god names, we know kinship terms, we know some numbers. For example, this finding of a dice gives us the exact numbers from 1 to 6, though we don't know for sure which one is which. Are there any traces of Etruscan in modern languages? Well, since we don't know that many Etruscan words to begin with, it's hard to tell. At the same time, we know that so many city names in Italy come from Etruscan, including Florence, Pisa, Parma, Modena, and so many more. Also, the word person, which descends from Latin persona, comes from Etruscan persu, which means mask. Probably in the future we'll discover that Etruscans and their language had a much bigger impact on our modern languages. In the end of the 5th century AD, once great Roman Empire was getting close to its end. It was helplessly trying to push away the hordes of barbarians, but nothing seemed to work. In despair, already Christian Romans turned towards haruspices, the traditional Etruscan diviners who predicted the future based on the entrails of sacrificed animals. Not that it helped them, but just imagine that. Etruria is long gone, but for one last time, Etruscan words were pronounced hundreds of years after the last native speaker passed away. This divination practice could be another proof of Anatolian origins, since it was common in the Middle East. For now that there is no conclusive proof, you are free to believe in a theory you prefer, or you can create your own and try to prove it. And maybe you will be the one who finally deciphers the Etruscan language and solves the mystery of the Etruscans. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in our next exploration.